Did you know, from 2009 to 2018, at least 288 school shootings took place, leaving more than 228 students traumatized and affected by this senseless violence. 18% of school shootings have occurred since the popularized, devastating tragedy that took place in December 2012 at Sandy Hook Elementary School. When I began speaking, did you think that these would be facts from the United States? These are among the numerous horrendous facts that inspired our research into why North America needs youth peace and security. My name is Katrina Leclerc, and I am a PhD student at St. Paul University based in Canada, and my research focuses on the synergies between the United Nations peace and security frameworks that pertain to women and young people. I co-wrote this paper entitled North America Needs Youth Peace and Security, Young People Shifting Tides for Positive Peace, with my colleague Shane Wong, who is a master's candidate in Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Manitoba. In our research, we argue that North America needs to implement the UN Security Council resolutions on youth peace and security domestically in order to address barriers and protect young people. With the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the rate of youth activism increased as the world shifted to a digital one. The pandemic has brought to light various systemic injustices that could no longer be hidden as they were in the pre-COVID world. With the increased rate of youth-led social justice movements and activism, young people have pushed for increased awareness of the dangers faced by today's youth population and for the need of measures to protect youth and young people across North America. To argue this, we used two primary case studies, Canada and the United States, who have both been significantly impacted and seen increases in youth-led social justice movements, particularly since 2010 onwards. The concept of social justice has adapted and changed over time with the needs of society. The current understanding of social justice draws from the work of theorists such as John Rawls and Thomas Welzer, in addition to effects of globalization within society. Social justice is closely linked to the idea of equality and equal rights for all, and it embodies two concepts, the first being redistribution, which often focuses on compensation for injustices, and the second is recognition. Current social justice movements have been leaning towards recognition rather than redistribution, seeking the recognition for their group and the injustices that they have suffered. The rise of social justice movements in North America and around the globe have been growing steadfast, garnering international attention, which significantly increased during the COVID-19 pandemic, giving the vast turn to the online space. With over 1.85 billion young people around the world, it is clear that they have the potential for political, social, and economic power. But is this power being grasped and recognized? In December 2015, the United Nations Security Council adopted the first ever thematic resolution on youth peace and security. Resolution 2250 set the framework for the protection of young people in conflict, demanded their participation as equal actors in peace and security, ensured their role in the prevention of conflicts, paved the way for meaningful partnerships with young people, and outlines the needs for disengagement and reintegration. The adoption of the resolution and its subsequent two resolutions in 2018 and in 2020 are instrumental to the recognition of young people's roles in conflict and post-conflict recovery. Criticism has arisen, especially in the recent years, as state and non-state actors continue to view youth leadership in peace and security as exclusive to conflict zones, where overt violence was or had occurred. Given the rise of social justice movements in the United States and in Canada, peacebuilding actors founded the US YPS Coalition in 2019, followed by the creation of the Canadian Coalition for Youth Peace and Security in late 2020. Both networks engage in international YPS advocacy, including with the introduction of the US YPS Act in Congress in 2020, but they also collaborate to promote and uphold YPS priorities domestically. As most of us know, in 1969, Johan Galton introduced the concept of structural violence and defined the terms of negative and positive peace. He defined negative peace as the absence of personal violence and positive peace as the absence of structural violence. He largely equated the latter with social justice, as he claimed that the concept was ever-changing and sought to positively define conditions for peace. This conceptualization of positive peace is the fundamental argument for the needs of inwards-looking youth peace and security policies in Canada and the United States. This demonstrates the need for YPS to go beyond traditional security approaches and to address structural violence as the key threat to peace. The following Canadian and US examples will attempt to demonstrate this argument. At the beginning of 2020, Canada was swept up in an environmental movement that rapidly spread across the country. The Wet'suwet'en Solidarity Movement was in opposition to the approval and commencement of construction on the Trans Mountain Pipeline in Western Canada, which did not have the approval of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. The pipeline and subsequent land defense movement opened the eyes of not only Canada, but the international community to issues concerning the environment and injustice, rights violations, and inequality against Indigenous peoples. Young Indigenous land defenders organized various events such as protests and sit-ins, while also organizing a series of blockades, including more than 6 railway blockades across the country. During the course of the movement, there was various arrests made, including towards Indigenous leaders, activists, and young people. Many of the arrests have led to no charges being laid, further enforcing the belief that the police and the authorities have employed force and arrest as a mechanism of fear and intimidation. However, these tactics have had a reverse effect, mobilizing more Indigenous youth, activists, and community leaders to stand in solidarity with the movement. Environmental issues are closely linked to the issue of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited persons, the MMIWG2S. Using the example of pipelines, the man camps where pipeline workers live have had a history of being dangerous environments for Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ2+ individuals. Acts of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ2+ individuals is commonplace in these locations and also spills into the neighboring communities. The MMIWG2S crisis is a generations-old issue that has been described as a Canadian genocide, which Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ2+ individuals have been speaking up against for generations. Disproportionate danger and violence experienced by Indigenous youth calls to attention for the need for the United Nations Security Council resolution on youth peace and security to be implemented in Canada. Young Indigenous land defenders, in the case of the Wet'suwet'en, face dangers associated with not only other civilians perpetuating violence and discrimination against them, but also had the fear of violence, arrest, and further persecution from authorities such as the police. The MMIWG2S crisis has been described as, again, a Canadian genocide, which continues to affect Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ2+ individuals. Particularly, youth are highly affected by the crisis and remain vulnerable communities who still lack the adequate protection that they should require. Additionally, addressing issues and barriers experienced by the Indigenous peoples in Canada, such as land disputes, violence, and the MMIWG2S crisis, requires the participation of those directly affected by the decisions being made, and in this case, this is Indigenous peoples. It is estimated that nearly 1 out of 3 young people in Canada experiencing homelessness identify as LGBTQ2+. In addition to this, they frequently face unsafe shelters and emergency housing programs, exacerbating their already vulnerable status. The current COVID-19 pandemic has only acted as exasperating for the vulnerabilities and barriers faced by LGBTQ2+ youth in Canada. During the pandemic, LGBTQ2+ youth have been faced with inadequate and unaffordable housing. They have also been put at risk by being forced to isolate with potentially harmful relatives, often experiencing instances of homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia. Additionally, shelters across Canada often prove to be dangerous environments for LGBTQ2+ youth. Barriers and issues faced by youth include a lack of knowledge and training for staff, invisibility of LGBTQ2+ youth within the system, normalized homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia or other marginalizations, and problematic rules that can be inadequate in the scope and invasive. The insecurity and dangers faced by the LGBTQ2+ youth in terms of homelessness and the lack of available or willing supports has made these youth more vulnerable. Additionally, the issue of LGBTQ2+ youth homelessness and other issues faced by the community further exacerbate the issue of protection. The implementation of the Youth, Peace and Security agenda within Canada could bring these topics to light where they have been otherwise invisible within overall Canadian society. Between 1970 and 2019, over the span of nearly 50 years, there have been 1,316 school shootings in the United States. The 2018 high school shooting in Parkland, Florida, sparked national and international outrage. Yet another school shooting. Young people should be worried about their pencils, not their bullets. Following the 17 lives taken in Parkland and the culmination of several other mass shootings in the US, young people quickly mobilized and took the nation by surprise. Youth activists took to the streets to denounce gun violence and demand strict gun reform in their country. Parkland students, including Cameron Caskey, Jacqueline Corin, David Hogg, Alex Wynn, Sophie Whitney, and Emma Gonzalez, days after the shooting of their high school, strategically garnered media attention to generate a sense of common urgency among people all over the country. This also is what led to the foundation of the March for Our Lives movement. We argue that this demonstrates Galton's 1969 approach to structural violence, that the March for Our Lives movement continues to challenge the current structural violence endured by young people through the lack of gun control, which directly leads to increased school shootings. And thus, young people in the US live in a constant state of fear from the threat of violence. March for Our Lives directly and concrete policy demands also support this argument, as they demonstrate that these young people are actively challenging the structural violence imposed on them. This is highlighted under the protection pillar outlined by the Security Council Resolution 2250. Protection pillar of the Youth, Peace and Security agenda specifically reaffirms the need and the obligation of member states, in this case the US, to protect young people as civilians from violence. Another example of systemic and structural violence is seen through the legacy of slavery and racial inequality in the US. It is widely known that the US was founded and built on the backs of Black women and men. The national movements in the South, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 60s, shed light on the continued racial disparities in the country. In 2013, following the acquittal of the 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, the Black for Our Lives Matter movement was born. The overall lack of substantive response by the US government and other decision-making bodies for the violence perpetuated against Black Lives Matter protesters, for example, including the catalytic incident of the murder of George Floyd, among many others who have been killed due to racism, including Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and Dion Johnson, all demonstrate the immense structural violence that is present through racism in the US. Both the protection of young activists, falling directly under the Youth, Peace and Security pillar, and the overall principles of peace and security challenge these inequalities. Racial profiling of young Black men, assuming that they are inherently violent, is challenged by the YPS discourse. And stereotypes of young Black women and their over-sexualization also demonstrates the underlying biases and harmful assumptions. YPS principles call for the integration and recognition of young people as agents of peace rather than agents of war. This needs to be reflected internally in the US as well. These examples clearly demonstrate the need to embrace the notions that protection and participation of young people, outlined as some key pillars of youth, peace, and security, contribute to advancing social justice and peace and positive peace in their communities. Thus, young Black activists ought to be awarded the same protections by youth, peace, and security frameworks as others who live in conflict-affected and war-torn regions. To conclude, based on the concepts of negative and positive peace outlined by Galton in 1969 and the examples we've explored in our research from Canada and the United States, there is a clear need for a domestic implementation of the Youth, Peace and Security agenda. Specifically, the pillars of protection and participation are key within the North American context. As youth-led movements continue to rise, more and more young people are at risk and vulnerable, despite Canada and the US not being considered traditional environments for peace and security as they're not active conflict zones. The inclusion of everyday grassroots actors is key to peace building. This includes young people. The involvement of those directly impacted by decisions is instrumental to the success and achievement of peace. Without the participation and protection of local everyday actors, particularly young people, sustainable peace is not attainable.